I was 22 years old. It was the spring of 1978. I was in between universities and staying at my mother's house. And it was early evening. It was still light outside. I was in the kitchen, at the kitchen sink, washing dishes. And just out of the blue, no warning, I was struck blind. And I felt I was down on the kitchen floor. I guess I don't really know where it was. It was all blackness. There was no intervening step. You know, I was up and then I was down. There wasn't a motion down to that point. And it didn't remain that way for very long. I wasn't afraid. I didn't have any fear. But obviously I was interested in what was going on. Then I found myself bodiless. I don't recall having a body at all, just a visual sense of being out in space, away from the earth, looking back at the earth. And the earth, the surface of the earth began to undulate. It was gentle at first, but it began to increase in intensity and eventually reaching a point where there was an explosion. But it wasn't an explosion of the earth. It was an explosion from the earth. And there was obviously streaming light going away from the earth, and the tips, the outer edge, the tips of that light was all human faces and hands, billions of them, I guess. And that expansion reached a maximum point, and then it began to fall back in on itself and contract back down to the earth. And the earth began glowing like a luminous being or a small star. And then, poof, it was over. And then I found myself on the kitchen floor. I was concerned that I might have hit myself or something on the way down on the edge of the countertop, but I was uninjured. My knees weren't hurt. There was no injury. Obviously, I was, confused and dazed by what had just happened. And I stood back up slowly and kind of absent-mindedly began washing a dish again. And it happened again. Bam! Just blindness and darkness, away from the earth, the undulation, the explosion, and then back down to a luminous being. The second time there was a message at the end. It wasn't auditory. I guess it was a telepathic conveyance. And it just said very simply, "This is good." I guess it was kept simple so that I wouldn't confuse the message. But it was just, "This is good." And then it was over. And I had had no experience like that prior to this, and I have had none since. So it's the only experience like that I've had. And it put me on a decades-long journey toward trying to understand, what was that? How did it happen? By what means? By what process could that have occurred? And so I began reading philosophy and reading about quantum physics and trying to understand, because ultimately quantum physics says there's nothing there except vibration and energy, which obviously is very close to what Nikola Tesla said. If you want to understand the universe, think energy, vibration, and frequency. And so after 40 some odd years, I've been developing my own cosmology to try to explain that, to me at least. And it became very simple. We've struggled with the duality of mind-body thanks to Rene Descartes. And that doesn't work, and it leads to the hard problem of consciousness, as illustrated by David Chalmers. And ultimately, it's a form of idealism. I think Bernardo Kastrup these days is the most prolific and prescient philosopher promoting idealism. He has what he calls analytic idealism. I kind of think of idealism as being sort of like the term UFO. It's got so much baggage. There's so many versions of idealism. So rather than referring to it as idealism, I call it mentism, as, mentation, thinking. And it seems to be a more appropriate descriptor of the whole idea anyway, as opposed to idealism. So it's mentism. I refer to it as observism, referring to the observer effect in quantum physics, where it's, at least according to the Copenhagen translation, that it takes a conscious observer to collapse the probabilistic wave function into an observable or measurable result. I don't believe there's anything but consciousness and perception in consciousness. And thereby it's a monistic theory, hypothesis, that there is only consciousness. And that makes sense to me after all these years of thinking about it. And that what we have is our perception in consciousness. And that's all we have. The material world, the perception of the material world is real. But the material world is not. It's just your perception. And that, to me, is how I could have been transported from where I was washing dishes to being out in space with no body and observing what I observed. So, it's led me to that point, and it's very difficult to find any kind of a forum or venue to discuss this. I don't have any other bona fides or credentials to justify me having this point of view other than my experience 43 years ago now. But that's where it has led me, and I guess, I don't know, I'd like to be able to talk with other people, other philosophers. I guess that might be a conceit, considering myself a philosopher, but it is an ontological cosmology that actually makes a lot of sense to me. It also pretty much explains how there can be the quantum paradoxes of entanglement, for instance, where you can have particles communicating with each other over billions of light years instantaneously. Well, I believe we exist in a consciousness singularity. Just like a black hole is a singularity, science acknowledges singularity. Within a singularity, infinities abound, and mathematicians are, of course, not happy with that. But it's an accepted concept, and so I'm positing a concept of a singularity of consciousness, and I call that primary consciousness. And I think we are partitioned bits of that consciousness. We're still part of the whole, and the whole is incomplete without us. And that by itself gives us meaning, besides the fact that if there is this consciousness singularity, then it takes a focused intent, the decision to create the partition, and then the implementation of that decision through the force of will. So it is a deliberate, conscious act to create us, which means that we are not without purpose, that there is a purpose for us, that we are identical. In a sense, it kind of jives with the religious concept And I'm no longer religious. I'm spiritual but not religious. That's SBNR. About 30% of the U.S. adult population is there at SBNR. But it jives with the religious concept of being made in the image of God, that we are, in fact, part of that primary consciousness, identical. It includes the whole concept of a holographic nature of reality, that any part of the whole contains the entirety of the whole. And I know that the idea of the fractal is kind of more of a physical analogy, but the Mandelbrot Set is the most amazing representation of the concept of infinity. Visual presentations that have been created from using that is it demonstrates as above, so below concept, where you cannot tell what scale you are at. There's the scale, it looks the same no matter where you are within that scale, whether you're part of the huge or the infinitesimally small. Makes no difference. And then, the holographic principle includes the concept of the whole being contained in the individual parts. So, I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody else, but it makes a lot of sense to me and explains a lot. It also means for those who have a fear of death, which I do not have any longer at all. You cannot physically die if you do not physically exist, and I do not believe we physically exist. We exist as a perception and consciousness. So it explains the transition in death and the near-death experiences. How you can go, it's basically, death is just a transition between perceptions. Most people that I've heard explaining their near-death experiences, they go to a new realm and they have a new body. I suppose it's necessary to some degree to have a body. I think the body is I think we are eternal, limitless beings, just like the primary consciousness. We're secondary consciousness. We exist in an arena of choice and consequence. Choice and consequence leads to truth and value. Truth and value imparts wisdom and compassion. Wisdom and compassion inevitably leads to love, which is the entirety of the point of existence. That unconditional, non-judgmental acceptance of who and what you are. I believe meaning, I've been confounded by the definition, the denotation of meaning, because it's in the dictionaries, it's a meaningless definition. I think meaning is truth proportional to value. That is, a truth may have a certain amount of value from someone's perspective and a different amount of value to another one's perspective. So the meaning is different between the two individuals. But the truth is the same, but the value of it may vary between individuals, and that's what gives it its meaning. If we are eternal, limitless beings, the only way you can grow is to put yourself at a point where you are limited. So we are in this, and I don't call it incarnations, I call it an iteration. I believe we do it over and over and over, and it may be here on Earth, it may be who knows where. We may be a human, we may be a non-human, we may be a plant, we may be a photon or an electron. I actually think that, the point of view from a photon would be extraordinary and elegant and timeless. So I believe we experience everything, and through our choices and our consequences, we learn. And then, when we've done what we came to accomplish, we transition. I believe we take a breather in between iterations to assimilate. I believe that there is a period of adjustment in between iterations, and where you probably have your soul groups and others who, and this is not solipsism at all. You are interacting with other consciousnesses, other partitioned bits of secondary consciousness by the quadrillions. Okay, so it's not a solipsism at all. A lot of people accuse idealism, some aspects of idealism, of being a solipsism, where you think you're the only thing that exists, which is ridiculous. And that's not where I am at all. If you affect the spin of the one paired or entangled particle, the other particle spin adjusts instantly to the opposite of that spin. It's an instantaneous, and they've performed many experiments and proven that there is no time lag, there is no delay. You could be a billion light years apart and it still occurs instantaneously, so that there is this transmission of information. The integrated information theory is also an interesting theory of cosmology. But that information travels between the particles. Bear in mind, if you're in consciousness singularity, there is no distance. There's no space in between. So that communication can occur instantaneously, at least within that realm. And I think reality is a duality, in the sense that it is both the best clues for understanding relationships, truth, choice and consequence, the relationships between beings, between particles. I think the pursuit of science is a great pursuit. It gives us more and more information to incorporate into our own thoughts. But it's also the biggest distraction from the truth that there is. In other words, as Einstein said, reality is an illusion, albeit a stubbornly persistent one. So it's a distraction from understanding our true nature, that we are pure consciousness, we are perception and consciousness. Your perception of the material universe is real, the material universe is not. Now, there is no such thing as materiality. It's a concept within consciousness, but there is no reality to that existence other than through your perceptions. And the only thing any of us ever know is our consciousness. That's all you know. Science likes to pride itself on objectivity, when it simply cannot be so, because every experimental result is filtered through their subjective consciousness. There's no way it can be objective in this sense. So you may have a consensus, a lot of people may agree that the results are the same, and I suppose you could call that an objective finding. But, science has been loath to even acknowledge the existence of consciousness until very recently, where there's so much pressure on it now that it has no choice. It has to admit, without consciousness, none of the other fundamental forces exist. Gravity, the strong and the weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, they don't exist without an observer. They don't exist without consciousness. So consciousness is much more fundamental a force than any of the acknowledged standard forces of physics. I want to sit and talk with people and nail this down. I think it's such a different perspective than materialism, which is purposeless, meaninglessness, hopelessness. It's all just a mechanical thing. We are meat puppets. That's such garbage. No one feels that way about themselves. No one. It is a flawed model. And in this model, you are a deliberate expression of a higher consciousness. If you want to call it God, that's fine. If you want to call it primary consciousness, if you want to call it a probabilistic singularity, if you want to call it Scooby-Doo, doesn't matter. It's a higher consciousness. Now, most people will admit that there is consciousness that is higher than their own. So, in a fractal sense, then there's no limit to what that consciousness could be. But we are meaningful, purposeful creations of consciousness. There is no such thing as meaninglessness within this model. So it means that there's no death. It means that you have meaning. It's a very hopeful cosmology, and it's the most parsimonious model I can think of. Pure consciousness, perception, and consciousness. The only assumption in this model is that consciousness is the only thing that exists, and that you have perception within consciousness. That's the nature of consciousness. So there's only one assumption, and according to the law of parsimony, scientific law of parsimony, because it has so many fewer assumptions than materialism, which is all based on assumptions anyway. Scientists don't like to look at that part of the mirror, where they have to realize that everything they believe is also based on assumptions, and nothing is physically rock solid as a truth. It's basically assumptions. Whereas this has one assumption. So by the scientific law of parsimony, it is much more likely that observism is closer to truth than materialism. I guess I babble a little bit, but there's so much to talk about. I have virtually no opportunity to talk about it. You're the first person I've had a chance to talk to about it in years. I can talk to my son about it, and that's about it. I would love to have just some other guys. I'd love to be able to talk to Bernard and Kastrup. I've had some email conversations with him, but not recently, and I can't seem to locate those emails or his email address. So I'm trying to talk to him on Twitter, because he is active on Twitter. You got Donald Hoffman, Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell and his simulation theory, I think, opened up a whole new arena of people who can accept the aspect of spirituality that his model allows, without having to depend on the concept of God. A lot of people, just because of 400 years of materialism, the idea of God has become anathema. Nobody wants to talk about it. And, religions are the greatest source of conflict in existence. They're human constructs, and they're flawed. Not to say that the messengers who are responsible for their founding weren't enlightened beings, but actually it's almost like a Eastern mysticism 2.0. If you changed the word illusion in the Vedas, in the translations of the Vedas, to perception, it's a whole different meaning, but it's a lot closer to exactly what I'm saying. In the Buddhist traditions, and Buddhism is not a religion. It's an Eastern mysticism. It's a series of practices and teachings, but there's no central anything. And there's thousands of gods and goddesses and lesser beings, but one of the biggest aspects in Buddhism is the concept of the goddess Maya being a trickster, in that she causes you to believe in the illusion of your existence. And that's so close to what I'm saying. It's not an illusion, though. It is your reality. If you step in front of a bus, you're going to transition, okay? So in that respect, it is reality, but it's not materially or physically real. All it is your perception within your own consciousness, which is a part of a much larger, fully integrated consciousness singularity. And I do believe that the ultimate goal of all of this is to create the understanding of love. I tried to interpret, and I needed to interpret what was it that I experienced? What did it mean? And my translation is that it was a symbolic representation of humanity reaching a higher level of consciousness all at one point. That it doesn't take everyone reaching it. It takes a core group of dedicated searchers and spiritual seekers reaching a critical mass to create it a higher level of existence, higher level of consciousness for everyone, everything on what we think is this planet. So it was a symbolic, it's kind of like Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the noosphere, which he envisioned as sort of like an atmosphere surrounding the earth of consciousness, of human consciousness, as a protective layer of human consciousness around the earth. That was his concept, and it's similar to what I'm thinking. I'm very hopeful for the future, very optimistic that we will actually achieve that. It's not going to be paradise or nirvana, but it will be an excellent next step and a much, much better existence for everyone and everything. There will still be challenges, otherwise there's no point. But I think the challenges will be at a higher level, and that we will be able to meet those challenges and grow again. I think there are steps, kind of like quantum leaps, where enough energy is available for a quantum leap is when an electron in an orbital around an atom goes up to a higher orbital. But there is no intervening step. There's no motion between a higher orbital and the lower orbital. So it's just an instantaneous jump to a higher level. And that's what I mean about reality being the clues for the relationships. You know, that seeing things in quantum physics can have analogous or metaphorical meaning to us in our lives. That the reason that electron reaches a higher orbital is that enough energy is imparted to that electron that it makes that jump. Then, when it falls back down, as they will, it gives off that same amount of energy. For instance, a fluorescent light, you pass electricity through it, the electrons passing through the fluorine gas excite the electrons in that gas 60 times a second on, 60 times a second off. And when those electrons fall back down, they give off a photon, and that's how you get light out of a fluorescent bulb. You know, we use those clues for creating light, and, the light is, I think of the consciousness singularity. If you imagine the dark of night, very foggy night, but there's a light on a lamppost, 30, 40 feet away from you. That's how I kind of imagine, consciousness singularity as this point of light, pixelated. The deeper you go into it, the more pixelated it becomes. That's the fractal nature of it. So that there can be an infinite or multiple infinities of existences within that singularity, which is how come we can perceive the universe, and that it's all a consciousness presentation to us. But, for instance, Albert Einstein was walking with another physics professor one time, and they were talking about the uncertainty principle, and Einstein said to him, I think it was Abraham Pace, so you mean to tell me that when I'm not looking at the moon, it's not there? And basically, he said, yeah, that's what I mean. So, in other words, like, we see the moon, but for all of us here on Earth, we only perceive it as this visual. We can't smell it or touch it. But if you go up, if you perceive that you have launched on a rocket and have landed on the moon, all of a sudden, then you'll have to have tactile sensations and other sensory input to provide you with that experience. But without you actually being there, none of that's necessary. And in the visual field, is the only a very small central part of your vision is detailed. The rest of it is very fuzzy. It's not necessary for us to be provided with that much more information. So you only get what's right, very focused in front of you, in front of where you are looking. So all of that just fits in to me very nicely with the concept of it just being consciousness. And that's the only thing that each of us knows is true. That is the only thing that we know is true, is our own existence through perception in consciousness. That's all we got. And I think we're kind of at the point of materialism where, we're still kind of Stone Agers, beating rocks together, only now, instead of spearheads, out pops an iPhone or something. And I think as we realize, as we intuit and incorporate into our being that everything is consciousness, then there's also the double split experiment. Everybody talks about how the photons, if they are observed, they become a particle and show up as a point in as opposed to if they are not observed, all you get is an interference pattern. So, but no one ever talks about, well, how does that particle know it has been observed when all that's doing the observation is consciousness? Then the only thing that can accept that it has been observed is another consciousness. But that aspect of the double split experiment is never discussed. It is never talked about. That it's one of those convenient things that scientists just avoid because they have no answer for it. How can an electron or a photon know that it has been observed and react accordingly? Well, it can if it's conscious. Now, that also brings up the thought of panpsychism, but that's too messy, and I don't think that's what it is. But, if somebody is more comfortable thinking of it as panpsychism, fine. But it's not that I think, rock is alive. I think it's consciousness. It's made of consciousness because that's the only thing that exists. Now, whether or not it's conscious consciousness, that's an area of exploration right there. So again, I can stop now. Well, I think that covers pretty much what I want to say. I did remember to point out that interpretation of what I think my experience was. I think it's very hopeful, very optimistic worldview, cosmology, or belief system, whatever you want to call it. Very hopeful. I'd love to share it. I really would. I think it could make a very positive difference in a lot of people.